Today we're going to talk about warming up, and we're going to have an example warm-up to perform before engaging in exercise. Our warm-ups are going to be split into two separate parts, the first being stretching and flexibility training, which is going to include stretches for our upper and lower body that are going to take place both seated and standing. We're also going to have our warm-up exercises, which are going to be split into three subcategories, those being our abdominal exercises and plyometrics, aerobic exercises, and anaerobic and strength-based exercises. We're going to start with our standing stretches. Our first stretch is going to be bending over and touching our toes. Here my feet are about knee width apart, and I'm leaning forward and reaching as far as I can. This stretch can also be done by putting your feet together and reaching in the same manner. Next, we're going to cross one leg over the other, and we're going to reach down towards the foot of the leg that has not moved. As you can see here, I'm reaching down one hand at a time towards my right foot, and I'm holding each stretch for about 5 to 10 seconds. You can also perform this stretch with a variation where you reach towards your foot with both hands at the same time. However, I find one hand allows for better balance. This stretch will also be working your hamstrings and putting more tension on them. Next, we want to put our legs apart as shown here, and reach down towards each leg, one at a time, with the opposite hand. We can also perform a variation in which we reach with both hands at the same time, as shown here. Lastly, we want to reach down towards the middle, in the same fashion as when we touched our toes. Next, we're going to move on to our seated stretches. Our first stretch is going to be our sit and reach. Very similar to touching your toes, you're going to reach forward as far as you can and try to touch your toes. Next, we'll cross one leg over, pull it back, and stretch our torso in the opposite direction. This will be stretching out our leg abductors, our glutes, and our trunk. Once we finish, reach across the other leg over and perform the same exercise on the other side. Next, we're going to get into a butterfly position to stretch out our adductors, then pull our feet in as close as we can, and straighten out our torso. Next, we get into this position here, stretch out our quadriceps. We also want to lean back as far as we can, to a point where we can feel the tension, but we don't injure ourselves or feel any pain. Once we finish one side, we should switch legs and perform the same stretch on the other side. Lastly, we'll go to our upper body stretches. Our first will be this crossover. We grab our arm in this fashion. This will be stretching out our lats and our shoulders. Once you finish, switch sides. You may also feel it useful to rotate your hands, as I've done here, to work your wrist and to stretch out muscles of your forearm. Lastly, we want to get into this tricep extension position and push our arms backwards so that we're reaching towards our shoulder blades. Switch sides, and again, push down your elbow so that your hand is reaching towards your shoulder blades. We see the same stretch here from a posterior view, with each hand reaching towards the opposite shoulder blade. Some performance tips now for our stretches. We should stretch to a point where it feels uncomfortable, but not painful. We should then hold that stretch for about 5 to 10 seconds at a time. We want to keep in mind that all our stretches here are static or isometric, meaning they don't involve any movement. So we should also avoid bouncing our stretches. If you're not sure what bouncing is, we'll have an example right here. As you can see here, I'm bouncing my stretch, or moving past my full range of motion. You want to avoid moving during any stretches that can lead to muscle cramps and long-term muscle injuries. Now we're going to move on to our warm-up exercises. We're going to start with our abdominal exercises and plyometrics. Our first exercise is going to be the leg raise. We're going to lift our legs to about a 90-degree angle, and we're going to lower them in a controlled fashion so that our feet don't touch the floor. Next, we're going to move on to crunches. Again, we want to avoid our feet touching the floor, and we also want to keep our shoulder blades off the ground at all times. Here we have scissors. Again, we'll try to keep our shoulder blades off the ground to activate our abdominal region as much as possible. Now we'll move on to our side toe touches, and again, we're keeping our shoulder blades off the ground. Lastly, we're going to perform our plank. Here is our plank position, and we're going to try to keep our shoulders and hips in line. Following an abdominal workout, we should always stretch out our abs by getting in this position and pushing off against the ground so that our torso stretches upwards. Now some performance tips for our abdominal workouts. We want to pick 2 to 3 of these workouts to perform per warm-up. We also want to work in the rep ranges of 10 to 20. However, if you're not sure of your capacity, you may also find it useful to work reps to failure for about a minute. Ideally, we want to repeat this process for 3 rounds or 3 sets. Now we're going to move on to our aerobic exercises. We're going to start with some arm circles to warm up our shoulders and upper body. These should vary in size, and you can perform them in both directions. Now we'll move on to some jumping jacks. And lastly, we'll do some knee rotations. If you're someone who has knee issues or knee problems, you may find this useful before engaging in exercise. Lastly, we'll go on to our anaerobic and strength exercises. We're going to start with push-ups. We want to get into a plank-like position where our shoulders and hips are in line, and we want to come down so that our elbows form a 90-degree angle. We also want to make sure that at our lowest point, our chest is no more than 2 inches off the ground. Lastly, we'll perform some air squats. We want to come down so that our upper leg is parallel to the ground and our knee forms about a 90-degree angle. We also want to make sure we keep our heels on the ground at all times. Lastly, some performance tips for aerobic and anaerobic exercises. We want to make sure we maintain proper form in order to get the most out of our workout and also to avoid injuries. We want to work again in the rep range of 10 to 20 repetitions, or reps to failure if you're not sure of your capacity. We also want to practice progressive overload and add another set or repetition with every coming warm-up.